August 1943. Hans Müller stood in a field near Medicine Hat, Alberta, and stared at the German soldier working 50 meters away. The man was ploughing a field, real ploughing, with a real tractor, not as punishment, not under guard, just farming like it was the most normal thing in the world. A Canadian farmer stood next to the tractor, explaining something about the engine. The German nodded and adjusted something. The tractor sputtered, then smoothed out. The farmer clapped the German on the shoulder. The German smiled. Hans turned to the Canadian guard beside him. The guard was sitting on a fence post, reading a newspaper, the Edmonton Journal, sports section. He looked up when Hans approached. "Something wrong?" the guard asked. His voice was casual, bored even. Hans didn't know how to explain what was wrong. Everything was wrong. Or maybe nothing was wrong. That was the problem. That was what made his head hurt and his stomach feel strange. "That man," Hans said in broken English, pointing at the German on the tractor, "he's just working?" The guard looked confused by the question. He glanced at the German farmer, then back at Hans. "Yeah, we need help with harvest. He volunteered, gets paid 50 cents a day. Money goes into his account at camp. He can buy cigarettes, writing paper, whatever he wants from the store." Paid. The word hit Hans like a punch. German prisoners of war were getting paid to work on Canadian farms. Getting paid in real money. Money they could spend. The guard went back to his newspaper. Hans stood there trying to process this information and failing completely. This was August of 1943, and everything Hans knew about being a prisoner of war was collapsing around him like a house made of cards in a strong wind. Just 3 months before, Hans had been fighting for Germany in North Africa. He wore his Afrika Korps uniform with pride, the tan shirt, the shorts, the peaked cap that marked him as part of Rommel's legendary desert fighters. He believed Germany would win the war. He believed it with the certainty that young men have before the world teaches them different. He believed the Allies were weak and decadent, that German soldiers were superior, that the cause was righteous and just. His officers told him stories about what happened if you got captured. The enemy would torture you for information. They would starve you. They would work you to death in labor camps. Prisoners of war suffered terrible fates, the propaganda said. The British were cruel colonial masters. The Americans were barbaric gangsters. And the Canadians? Nobody talked much about the Canadians. They were just colonials, farmer boys who didn't know how to fight properly. Not real soldiers like Germans. Then Hans's unit got surrounded at Tunisia in May 1943. It happened fast. British tanks came from one side, appearing out of the dust like metal ghosts. American artillery opened up from the other direction, shells screaming down with mathematical precision. Hans's unit had no fuel left, no ammunition, no food, no water. They had been cut off for 3 days. His commander, a major who had fought since 1939, stood in the command tent and looked at the maps for a long time. Then he picked up a white flag. 250,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners in North Africa that month. Hans was one of them. He was 22 years old. He thought his life was over. The British put him on a truck with 40 other prisoners. They drove to the coast. Nobody beat them. Nobody shot anyone. They just moved them efficiently, like logistics, like cargo. At the port, they loaded prisoners onto a ship. Hans expected a cargo hold, darkness, maybe chains. Instead, they went into the lower decks where bunks had been installed. Crowded, yes. Uncomfortable, definitely. But there were blankets. There was food. Thin soup and hard bread, but food. The ship crossed the Mediterranean to England. At Southampton, they transferred prisoners to another ship. This one was bigger. a converted passenger liner, and this one was crossing the Atlantic. For 12 days, Hans stood on the deck when allowed and watched endless ocean. The water was grey, the sky was grey, everything was grey. The other prisoners whispered rumours. They were going to Canada. Canada was ice and snow and wilderness. They would freeze to death in winter. They would be worked until they died cutting down trees in forests. They would never see Germany again. That's what everyone said. But when the ship finally reached Halifax in July 1943, guards marched them off the dock and onto trains, real passenger trains, not cattle cars, not freight wagons, actual passenger trains with seats and windows. Hans sat by a window and watched Canada appear. He expected to see a frozen wasteland, a primitive backwater. Instead, he saw green forests stretching to the horizon, rich farmland with crops growing in neat rows, towns with paved streets and electric lights, factories with smokestacks. Everything looked organized. Everything looked like it worked. Everything looked wealthy. The train traveled for 3 days. Hans watched the country roll past and felt his understanding of the world shifting. Mountains appeared, massive and snow-capped even in summer. Rivers as wide as anything in Germany. Prairie land that seemed infinite, grass moving in waves like an ocean. Small towns where people went about their lives like there wasn't a war happening at all. Sometimes the train stopped at stations to take on water or coal. Canadian civilians stood on the platforms. They stared at the German prisoners through the windows. Some looked angry, their faces hard, their eyes full of hate. Hans understood that. Canada was at war with Germany. These people probably had sons or husbands fighting. Some looked just curious, examining the enemy like you might look at a strange animal at a zoo. But nobody spat at them. Nobody threw things. Nobody screamed. The train finally stopped at a place called Medicine Hat. Hans had never heard of it. He didn't know what medicine or hats had to do with anything. They marched the prisoners through town. Canadian civilians stopped on sidewalks and watched. Children pointed. Women whispered to each other. Men stood with arms crossed. The prisoners marched past shops and houses and churches. Everything looked normal, peaceful, like the war was happening on another planet. They marched the prisoners out of town, down a dirt road, past farms where cows grazed and chickens scratched. Hans expected to see walls rising up in the distance, guard towers with machine guns and searchlights, the reality of a prisoner of war camp. What he saw instead made him stop walking. The guard behind him had to push him forward to keep the column moving. There was a fence, but it was low, maybe 2 meters tall. Chain link, not barbed wire. He could see through it easily. On the other side were wooden buildings arranged in neat rows. A flagpole with a Canadian flag moving in the wind. Guards standing around talking to each other, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. No towers, no machine gun nests, no spotlights. The gates stood open. A truck drove out as they watched, just drove right out, through the open gates. Nobody stopped it. Hans could see past the fence to farms beyond, fields of wheat, a red barn, a house with smoke coming from the chimney. If he ran right now, this second, he could probably get away. That thought terrified him more than any fence could, because if it was this easy to escape, why didn't they have bigger fences? Either the Canadians were incredibly stupid, or there was something Hans didn't understand yet. And Hans was starting to suspect it was the second option. They processed the prisoners in a wooden building that looked like a schoolhouse. Forms to fill out, names, ranks, units. A Canadian officer who spoke perfect German explained the rules.
You follow camp regulations. You respect guards. You work when assigned. You don't try to escape. In return, you get fair treatment under the Geneva Convention. You get food, shelter, medical care, and the opportunity to work if you want. That last part made Hans's head snap up. Opportunity to work. The officer continued. We need farm workers. Harvest season is coming. Any prisoner who volunteers gets assigned to a local farm. You work normal hours. You get paid 50 cents per day. The money goes into an account. You can buy things from the camp store. Cigarettes, candy, writing paper, books, whatever we have in stock. Work is completely voluntary. You can refuse. No punishment for refusing. Hans heard these words and thought he misunderstood. Voluntary? He asked in German. The officer nodded. Yes, voluntary. We can't force prisoners to work under Geneva Convention rules unless it's camp maintenance. Farm work is optional, but most men volunteer. Gets you outside, gives you something to do, and 50 cents adds up over time. Hans looked at the other prisoners. They all had the same stunned expression. Work was optional. They got paid. They could buy things. This was a prisoner of war camp. They assigned Hans to Barracks C. He walked inside expecting the worst. Wooden bunks stacked 3 high, thin mattresses, no heat, maybe a bucket in the corner for a toilet. The reality was different. The barracks was a clean wooden structure with real beds. Not bunks stacked high, but actual beds arranged in rows. Each man got his own bed with 2 wool blankets and a pillow. A real pillow, not a sack of straw. There were windows with glass and screens to keep bugs out. A wood stove sat in the middle of the room for heat. Shelves along the wall where you could put personal items. The floor was swept clean. It looked better than some German army barracks Hans had slept in. It looked better than his bedroom at home. That first night, Hans lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling. The blankets were warm. The pillow was soft. Outside, he could hear the wind across the prairie, a constant whisper. He could hear guards talking outside, their voices carrying in the clear air. They were laughing about something, just laughing, like normal people. He could hear nothing that sounded like a prison. No screaming, no gunshots, no cries of pain. Nothing. And that scared him more than barbed wire ever could. Because if this wasn't a prison, what was it? The next morning, a bell rang at 6 a.m. Hans got up, his body responding before his mind fully woke. He expected to be marched somewhere at gunpoint. Roll call in the cold, shouting guards, maybe beatings if you were too slow. That's what mornings meant in the German army. Instead, a guard just pointed toward a large building. Breakfast is there, the guard said in English, then repeated it in broken German. Frühstück. You got 30 minutes. No shouting, no rifles, just directions. Hans walked to the dining hall with 100 other prisoners. Nobody marched in formation, they just walked, like civilians, like free men. The smell hit him before he entered the building. Bacon, real bacon cooking on a griddle, coffee, fresh bread baking. His stomach made a noise so loud the man next to him looked over. Bacon, the man whispered in German. I smell bacon. Hans nodded. He couldn't speak. When was the last time he smelled bacon? Before the war? His father used to cook bacon on Sunday mornings, but that was 1938, 5 years ago, a lifetime ago. The prisoners lined up inside the dining hall. It was a large room with long tables and benches. Canadian cooks stood behind a counter. They wore white aprons and looked like regular cooks, not guards, not soldiers, just men who cooked food for a living. A man with a moustache waved Hans forward and started putting food on his plate. 2 fried eggs, yolks bright yellow. 3 strips of bacon, cooked crispy. 2 slices of toast with butter, real butter in little squares. A cup of coffee, black and steaming. A small bowl of fruit, canned peaches swimming in syrup. Hans took his tray to a table and sat down. He just sat there and stared at his plate. This was more food than he got in the German army. This was more food than German civilians were getting. He knew because his mother's letters talked about rations getting smaller every month, bread getting darker, mixing sawdust and potatoes into the flour to stretch it, meat disappearing completely, butter becoming a memory. And here he was, a prisoner of war, an enemy, with bacon and eggs and white bread and butter. He picked up his fork and took a bite. The eggs were perfect, cooked just right, not too hard, not too runny. The bacon was crispy on the edges, chewy in the middle, salty and rich. The coffee was hot and strong. He ate slowly at first, trying to make it last. Then, faster, his body taking over, hungry after months of short rations in North Africa. Then he couldn't stop. His fork moved automatically, scooping food into his mouth, barely chewing before swallowing. Around him, other prisoners ate the same way. Some men had tears running down their faces, crying while they ate. Nobody spoke. They just ate like men who had forgotten what full felt like. After breakfast, Hans walked outside and stood in the morning sun. His stomach was full, actually full. Not just the absence of hunger, but genuinely satisfied. The feeling was so strange, he almost didn't recognize it. A guard approached. "You want the work?" the guard asked in German. Hans nodded without thinking. The guard smiled. "Good. We need workers. Come with me." They loaded Hans and 20 other prisoners onto a truck. A Canadian guard rode with them, but he didn't have a rifle. He just had a clipboard with names. The truck drove out of camp, through the open gate, down a dirt road past farms. Nobody said anything about escape. Nobody warned them not to run. The guard just sat there with his clipboard. If Hans wanted to run, this was his chance. Now, right now, jump off the truck, run into that wheat field, disappear. None of the prisoners ran. Hans didn't fully understand why. Maybe because there was nowhere to go. Maybe because running meant giving up the bacon and eggs. Maybe because something in all of them had broken, and running required a will they no longer had. The truck stopped at a large farm. Fields of wheat stretched out in every direction, golden and ready for harvest. An older man walked out of a barn. He was maybe 60, with grey hair and weathered skin. He wore denim overalls and a straw hat. He looked at the German prisoners and nodded once. "Morning," he said in English. Hans understood enough to get the greeting. The farmer walked over to a tractor sitting in the yard. It was a John Deere, green and yellow paint faded from use. "Anyone here know how to drive one of these?" the farmer asked. Several prisoners raised their hands. Farm boys from Bavaria, Hans guessed. Men who had grown up driving tractors before they became soldiers. The farmer picked one man, a tall prisoner named Friedrich, who spoke a little English. The farmer spent 20 minutes teaching Friedrich the controls. This is the clutch. This is the brake. This lever controls the attachment. Then he just let Friedrich drive off into the field. Let a German prisoner of war drive his tractor. Alone. Unsupervised. If Friedrich wanted to drive that tractor all the way to British Columbia, nobody was stopping him. Hans got assigned to work loading hay bales. It was hard work. The sun beat down. Alberta in August was hot, hotter than he expected. His hands got cut from the rough twine around the bales. His back ached from bending and lifting. His shoulders burned. But it felt good to work. It felt good to do something useful, to accomplish something, to be more than just a prisoner waiting. At noon, the farmer's wife came out of the house. She was a round woman with grey hair and a kind face. She carried a basket covered with a cloth. She called out and the prisoners stopped working. She set the basket down on a table under a tree and started pulling out food. Sandwiches, thick slices of homemade bread with ham and cheese, apples, cookies, a jug of lemonade. She gave the food to the prisoners and the Canadian guard. Same food for everyone. No difference between guard and prisoner. Hans ate his sandwich and watched the farmer talking to Friedrich about crop rotation. They were having a real conversation about farming, about soil quality and rainfall and market prices. Like the war didn't exist. Like they were just two farmers talking about wheat yields. Like Friedrich wasn't a German soldier who 6 months ago might have killed Canadian soldiers. That evening, the truck brought them back to camp. Hans was exhausted, but in a good way, the kind of tired that comes from honest work. His muscles hurt, but it was a clean pain. That night at dinner, they got chicken and potatoes. Roasted chicken with crispy skin, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, carrots, fresh bread with butter. Hans ate until he couldn't eat any more, until his stomach hurt, until he had to stop. He went back to his barracks and lay on his bed. The blankets felt soft. The pillow cradled his head. Outside, the prairie wind whispered. Somewhere, a radio played music. American jazz, the kind the Nazis said was degenerate. It sounded beautiful. Hans closed his eyes and thought about his mother in Germany. What was she eating tonight? Probably bread and potatoes if she was lucky, probably less if she wasn't. And here he was, her son, the enemy, eating chicken and mashed potatoes with gravy. Over the next few weeks, Hans fell into a routine. Wake at 6, wash in cold water from pumps outside the barracks, breakfast in the dining hall, bacon and eggs most days, sometimes pancakes with syrup, sometimes oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins.
Work on the farm from 7 to 6, with a lunch break at noon. Back to camp for dinner, evenings free. The prisoners could walk around camp. They could sit outside and smoke if they had cigarettes. They could write letters home, though Hans didn't know what to say to his mother. How could he explain this? The routine was comfortable. Too comfortable. That was the problem. This wasn't supposed to be comfortable. He was a prisoner of war, the enemy. He should be suffering. But nobody was making him suffer. The guards were polite. The farmers treated him like a worker, not a slave. The food was good. The barracks were clean. There were no beatings, no torture, no starvation. Just a normal life, except he couldn't leave. But honestly, where would he go? He was in the middle of Canada. Germany was 5,000 miles away, across an ocean currently full of Allied ships and submarines. Even if he escaped the camp, then what? Walk across the prairie? Hide in the wilderness? He would die of exposure in the first winter. The Canadian officer had been right. There was nowhere to run. The camp had no walls because it didn't need walls. Geography was the prison. The distance itself was the fence. In September, something happened that changed everything. A German prisoner named Ernst got sick. Bad sick. Fever and chills that wouldn't break. Vomiting. Couldn't keep food down. He went from healthy to barely conscious in 2 days. The guards took him to the camp hospital immediately, not eventually, not when convenient, immediately. Real doctors looked at him, Canadian military doctors who normally treated Canadian soldiers. They diagnosed appendicitis. The appendix was inflamed and about to burst. They operated that same night. Canadian military surgeons, trained professionals, the same ones who treated wounded Canadian soldiers from the front, operated on a German prisoner. They used anesthesia so he wouldn't feel pain. They used antibiotics so he wouldn't get infected. They saved his life. Ernst came back to the barracks 2 weeks later with a scar on his belly and a story nobody could quite believe. He talked about Canadian nurses who checked on him every 2 hours, who brought him soup when he could eat again, who smiled at him and spoke kindly even though he was the enemy, who treated him like a patient, not like a German. One nurse was named Margaret. She had a brother fighting in Italy against Germany, but she still smiled at Ernst and brought him extra blankets when he was cold. Hans tried to process this. Germany was bombing Canadian cities, killing Canadian soldiers, sinking Canadian ships, and Canada was giving German prisoners surgery to save their lives, spending money on anesthesia and antibiotics and doctor time on the enemy. It didn't make sense, unless everything they had been told about the enemy was wrong, unless the propaganda was lies, unless Germany was wrong about everything. October brought the first snow. Hans had been warned about Canadian winter by other prisoners. It would be brutal, they said. Colder than anything in Germany, colder than Russia even. You could die just standing outside. But the barracks had good stoves. They got extra blankets in October, thick wool blankets that actually kept you warm. They got winter coats issued from stores, real winter coats with padding and hoods. They got boots, leather boots with wool linings. The Canadian government issued winter clothing to prisoners, real winter clothing, not thin rags, not substitutes, actual good winter gear. Hans wore his Canadian-issued coat and thought about German soldiers freezing on the Eastern Front in Russia. They were fighting for Germany in Russian winter with inadequate clothing because supply lines couldn't keep up, because resources were stretched too thin, because too much was going to SS units and not enough to regular army. German soldiers freezing to death in snow, and Hans was a prisoner in Canada with a warm coat and full belly. The absurdity of it kept him awake at night. In December 1943, something extraordinary happened that Hans would remember for the rest of his life. The camp organized a Christmas celebration. Hans thought it was a joke at first, prisoners celebrating Christmas. But the Canadians were completely serious. They brought in a huge spruce tree and set it up in the dining hall. They decorated it with handmade ornaments and strings of popcorn and paper chains the prisoners made during evening activities. They organized a choir of German prisoners to sing carols. They let prisoners make decorations from whatever materials they could find. They let them write letters home that would go through the Red Cross. And on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1943, they served a feast that Hans would never forget. Turkey. Real turkey. Roasted until the skin was golden brown. Ham glazed with brown sugar. Mashed potatoes in huge bowls, more potatoes than Hans had seen in years. Gravy made from real turkey drippings. Stuffing with herbs and onions. Cranberry sauce, bright red and sweet. Green beans with almonds. Dinner rolls with butter. And pie. 3 kinds of pie. Apple pie with cinnamon. Pumpkin pie with whipped cream. Mincemeat pie that smelled like Christmas. Hans sat at his table and stared at his plate. This was a Christmas dinner. A real Christmas dinner. Better than anything he had eaten in Germany even before the war, even when times were good, even when his father was alive and they had money. This was the kind of meal wealthy people ate, and it was being served to German prisoners of war. While he sat here looking at turkey and ham and 3 kinds of pie, his family in Germany was probably eating bread and potatoes, if they were lucky. His mother's last letter, which arrived in November, mentioned hunger. Constant hunger. She didn't complain directly, she just mentioned it in passing. Like it was normal now. Like hunger was just part of life.
Hans picked up his fork and took a bite of turkey. It was perfect, moist and seasoned and rich. He took another bite. Then he put down his fork. He couldn't eat anymore. Not because he was full, because he felt guilty. Why did he get to eat like this while his family starved? What kind of world was this where enemies ate better than families? After dinner, they sang Christmas carols. Silent Night, O Tannenbaum, Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Songs in German, songs from home. The Canadian guards stood along the walls and listened. Some of them sang along in English. Silent Night, Holy Night. The same song, different words. When the singing ended, one guard started clapping. Then others joined. They were applauding German prisoners singing German Christmas songs in Canada during a war. The Canadians were applauding the enemy. Hans felt tears on his face. He wiped them away quickly, embarrassed, but around him other men were crying too. Grown men, soldiers, warriors, crying over Christmas carols and turkey dinner. What had happened to them? What were they becoming? In January 1944, Hans got a letter from home. His brother Wilhelm had been killed in Italy in September, fighting near Naples, a mortar round. Quick death, the letter said. Like that made it better. His father was sick with something the doctors couldn't figure out. Probably malnutrition, probably tuberculosis, probably one of a dozen diseases that came when people didn't have enough food or heat or medicine. His sister Anna was working in a factory now, making ammunition, 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. His mother's ration had been cut again. Less bread, less potatoes, no meat at all anymore. The letter was 2 months old by the time it reached Canada. Things were probably worse now. Might be much worse. Wilhelm might not be the only dead one. Hans read the letter 3 times sitting on his bed. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. He walked to the camp administration building and asked to see the officer in charge of work details. A Canadian lieutenant with red hair and freckles. The lieutenant looked up from paperwork. "Yes," he said in German. "I want to send money home," Hans said. The lieutenant looked confused. "Send money? To Germany?" Hans nodded. "To my family, my mother. I work. I get paid 50 cents every day. I want to send money to my mother." The lieutenant thought about it for a long moment. "I don't know if that's possible. International money transfer during wartime to an enemy country. But let me check with headquarters. I'll ask." 2 weeks later, the lieutenant found Hans working in the camp workshop repairing tools. "We figured it out," the lieutenant said. "Red Cross can transfer money to Germany. It'll take months, probably 4 to 6 months, but it'll get there eventually. They convert it to Reichsmarks at whatever the rate is. How much you want to send?" Hans sent everything he had earned since August, $43 Canadian. Almost 6 months of work. It wasn't much in Canada, maybe enough to buy a few pairs of shoes. But in Germany on the black market, it might buy food, might keep his mother alive a little longer. The thought that he, a German soldier, was sending money earned working for Canada to help his family survive in Germany, it made his head hurt. The contradictions were too many. Nothing made sense anymore. Nothing fit together. The world was broken, and Hans couldn't figure out how to put it back together again. Spring came slowly in Alberta. The snow melted in March, turning everything to mud. The prairie turned green in April. Flowers appeared. Birds came back from wherever they spent winter. The air smelled fresh and clean. Hans had been a prisoner for almost a year now. A year of good food, warm shelter, fair treatment. A year of having his understanding of the world dismantled piece by piece. The propaganda had said the Allies were cruel. They weren't cruel. They were treating German prisoners better than Germany treated its own people. The propaganda had said Germany was superior, but Canada was richer, more organized, more advanced in every way that mattered. Better roads, better infrastructure, better food production, more resources, bigger country. The propaganda had said the war was necessary and just. But for what? To create this, destruction and hunger and death. For what? Hans started thinking dangerous thoughts, thoughts that would have gotten him arrested in Germany, thoughts that would have gotten him sent to a camp, a real camp, a German camp, where people died. Thoughts like, maybe Germany deserved to lose. Maybe they were the bad guys. Maybe everything he had believed since childhood was a lie, built on lies, built on more lies, until you couldn't see the truth anymore, even if you wanted to. In June 1944, news came about D-Day. The Allies landed in France, Normandy. Americans and British and Canadians stormed beaches and broke through German defenses. The Second Front had opened. The German prisoners in camp reacted in different ways. Some were defiant. Germany would still win, they said. Secret weapons were coming, jet planes, super tanks, wonder weapons. Just wait. Others were quiet. They knew what D-Day meant. Germany was losing. The war would end in defeat. Hans felt relief. He felt guilty about feeling relief, but he felt it anyway. Because if Germany lost, the war would end. The killing would stop. Maybe his family would survive. Maybe his mother would live. Maybe all of this could finally be over. And maybe, just maybe, Germany would become something different, something better, something that didn't lie to its people. Throughout 1944 and into 1945, more prisoners arrived. The camps filled up. Medicine Hat expanded. New barracks were built. Hans was an old-timer now, almost 2 years in camp. He helped new prisoners adjust. He explained the rules. He told them the Canadians wouldn't torture them, that the food was real, that yes, you really could walk around camp without guards pointing guns at you. Some new prisoners didn't believe him. They thought it was an elaborate trick, a psychological operation, make them comfortable, then spring the trap. But after a few weeks, they understood. This was real. Canada was actually treating them with dignity. Why? Nobody could fully answer that. Maybe because Canada had signed the Geneva Convention and actually meant it. Maybe because Canadians believed in rules even during war. Maybe because they thought treating prisoners well was the right thing to do. Or maybe they understood something Germany didn't, that kindness could be a weapon too, that showing the enemy they were wrong was more powerful than any bomb. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. Berlin was captured. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. Hans heard the news on a radio in the camp common room, a BBC announcer speaking in a clipped British accent. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. Hans sat in a chair and felt nothing. No joy, no sadness, just numbness, a vast emptiness. What now? What happened to German prisoners when the war ended? Did they just open the gates and say, "Go home"? Where was home anymore? The answer came slowly over the following weeks. The Canadian government announced that German prisoners would be repatriated, sent back to Germany, but it would take time, months, maybe a year. They needed ships, they needed organization, they needed to figure out which Germany to send prisoners to, because Germany was being divided. The Americans, British, French, and Soviets were each taking a zone. Germany wasn't even Germany anymore. They kept prisoners working through summer and fall of 1945. Hans kept going to the farm, kept ploughing fields and loading hay. The farmer he worked for, whose name was Robert, shook his hand on the last day of harvest. "You're a good worker," Robert said in slow English so Hans could understand. "If you ever want to come back to Canada, come work for me. I'll sponsor you. I'll help you immigrate." Hans nodded. He didn't trust his voice to speak. He didn't know what to say. How do you thank someone for offering you a future when your country tried to destroy his? In December 1945, 2.5 years after arriving, they told Hans he was going home. They put him on a train with 100 other prisoners. The train went east, all the way across Canada. Hans watched the country pass in reverse. Prairie, mountains, forest, cities. All of it familiar now. All of it feeling more like home than Germany did. At Halifax, they boarded a ship, the same port where Hans had arrived. Full circle. Hans stood on the deck as the ship pulled away from Canada. Other prisoners stood with him. Nobody talked much. What was there to say? They all knew what they were going back to. The letters had prepared them, letters that took months to arrive, letters that were censored, but letters that told the truth in ways that couldn't be hidden. Germany was destroyed. Cities were rubble. Millions of people were dead. The country was occupied by foreign armies. There was no food, no jobs, no future that anyone could see clearly. Hans pulled his Canadian winter coat tighter around him. He was allowed to keep it. Keep his clothes, keep his boots. Small mercies. He thought about the last 2.5 years. The bacon and eggs, the Christmas turkey, the farmer who taught him about crop rotation, the nurse who smiled at Ernst, the guard who just read the newspaper. All of it felt like a dream now. Had it really happened? Or would he wake up and find himself in a real prisoner camp, starving, beaten, barely alive? The ship crossed the Atlantic, the same ocean he had crossed in 1943 going the other way. But Hans was a different person now. He spoke English. He knew how farms worked. He understood what democracy looked like. He had seen what a country could be when it wasn't built on lies and hatred and the fantasy of superiority. The old Hans, who believed in the cause, was dead. Died somewhere between the bacon and eggs and the Christmas turkey and the farmer saying, "You're a good worker." This new Hans didn't know what he believed anymore, except kindness. Kindness was real. He had lived it for 2.5 years. And truth. Truth mattered. Propaganda was just lies wrapped in a flag and sold to desperate people who wanted to believe they were special. The ship docked in Hamburg in January 1946. Hans walked down the ramp and stepped onto German soil for the first time in almost 3 years. The smell hit him first. Smoke and dust and something rotten that he couldn't identify. Then he looked around and his heart sank into his stomach. Hamburg wasn't a city anymore. It was a graveyard. Buildings stood like broken teeth, walls standing but nothing behind them. Whole blocks were just piles of bricks and twisted metal. People walked through the streets like ghosts. Thin people, dirty people, people with empty eyes and hollow cheeks, and a look Hans recognized from newsreels of concentration camps. This is what the master race looked like now. This is what superiority had created. Hans made his way through the ruined streets. Every corner brought new horror. A church with no roof, walls standing but the inside burned out. A school that was just one wall with empty windows like dead eyes. A park that was now a crater filled with water. Bomb crater, probably. Hans passed people digging through rubble looking for anything useful. Bricks they could sell, metal they could trade, food that might be buried under the debris. Children with hollow cheeks begged for food. Old women pushed carts full of broken things they hoped to trade for bread.
It took Hans 3 days to get to his hometown. 3 days of walking and hitching rides on army trucks, American trucks, British trucks, all carrying supplies to occupation forces. 3 days of seeing nothing but destruction. Cities bombed to rubble. Villages abandoned. Fields full of bomb craters. Bodies still being dug out of collapsed buildings. This was Germany. This was the master race. This was what superiority looked like. When he finally knocked on his mother's door in his hometown that by some miracle was mostly intact, he barely recognized her. She had aged 20 years in 3. Her hair was white. Her face was lined and thin, skin pulled tight over bones. Her hands shook when she opened the door. She looked at him and screamed. Then she cried. Then she touched his face like she couldn't believe he was real. "Hans?" she whispered. "Hans?" "It's me, Mutter," he said. "I'm home." She pulled him inside and wouldn't let go of his arm, like he might disappear if she didn't hold on tight. The house was cold even though it was winter. Half the windows were boarded up with planks. The furniture was mostly gone, probably burned for heat during the winter. His mother made him sit down. She stared at him. "You're so healthy," she kept saying. "Look at you. You're so healthy. You must weigh 80 kilos, maybe more. How?" Hans realized he probably weighed 40 pounds more than her. He had color in his face, muscle on his arms. She looked grey. She looked like she was disappearing. His mother made tea from dried leaves and roots. Real tea was gone. Coffee was gone. Everything good was gone. She put a small piece of bread on a plate, dark bread that looked almost black, maybe 5 centimeters across. "This is half my ration for today," she said, "but you need to eat after your journey." Hans looked at that piece of bread. That was half a day's food, that tiny piece of bread. He thought about breakfast in Canada, the eggs and bacon and toast with butter, eating until he was full. Eating until he couldn't eat anymore, sometimes leaving food on his plate because he was so full. And here was his mother giving him half her daily bread. He couldn't eat it. He pushed it back to her. "Mutter, no, I'm fine. You eat." They argued. She insisted. He refused. Finally, they split it. Each ate a piece barely enough to register. Neither piece was enough to stop the hunger Hans could see in his mother's eyes. Over the next few days, Hans learned what life was like now in post-war Germany. Food rations were 1,000 to 1,500 calories per day, less than half what he got as a prisoner. People stood in line for hours to get their daily bread. Sometimes the bread didn't come. Sometimes the rations ran out before everyone got fed. The black market was the only place to get real food, but prices were insane. A loaf of real white bread cost 200 Reichsmarks. His mother's monthly pension was 150 Reichsmarks. Do the math. His brother Wilhelm was dead, killed in Italy. His father had died during the war, heart attack probably, but also probably malnutrition and stress. His sister Anna survived, but she looked 10 years older than she was. 28 years old, but looked 40. Her husband was gone, captured by Russians. Nobody knew where, probably dead in a camp somewhere in Siberia. They didn't talk about it. People asked Hans about the prison camp. He tried to explain. He told them about the food, 3 meals a day, bacon and eggs for breakfast, meat at lunch and dinner, the warm barracks with real beds and blankets, the lack of beatings, the lack of torture, the farm work he got paid for,
The Christmas dinner with turkey and ham and 3 kinds of pie. They looked at him like he was lying, like he was crazy, like he had lost his mind. Some people got angry. "You got fat while we starved," one neighbor said. His name was Herr Schmidt, and his son had died in Russia. "You were safe in Canada while we got bombed, while we dug bodies out of rubble, while we watched children starve."
"And you ate turkey?"
Hans understood the anger. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. He had been the enemy, the one Germany was fighting against, and he got treated better than German civilians, better than German soldiers, better than anyone in Germany. What kind of twisted world created that situation? At night, Hans lay on a thin mattress in his childhood room, the same room he had slept in before the war, but everything was different now. The window was cracked, covered with cardboard. The walls had water damage from rain getting through the roof. It was cold and damp and dark. He thought about his bed in Canada, the 2 wool blankets, the warm stove, the full stomach, the safety. In Canada, he had been a prisoner, but he felt free. He could walk around, he could work, he had purpose. Here, he was free, technically free, but felt trapped. Trapped by hunger, trapped by cold, trapped by despair. Trapped by the ruins of a country that had believed its own lies and now was paying the price. Hans started having a terrible thought, a thought that made him feel like a traitor, a thought that kept him awake at night. He missed Canada. He actually missed being a prisoner of war. How could that be possible? How could captivity be better than freedom? But it was true. In Canada, he had hope, he had food, he had friends, he had learned skills, he had been treated like a human being. Here, he was just another desperate German in a destroyed country with no future. Just another mouth to feed in a place that had no food. Months passed slowly. Winter of 1946 was brutal, cold and snow, and no heat except what you could burn in a stove. Hans tried to help rebuild. He worked construction, clearing rubble from destroyed buildings. The pay was almost nothing. Deutschmarks were nearly worthless. Inflation was crazy. Prices doubled every week. They paid him in food when they could, potatoes mostly, sometimes an egg, sometimes a bit of margarine. He gave most of it to his mother. He watched her eat tiny portions and thought about that Christmas turkey in Canada. The waste of it, the abundance, all given to prisoners, to enemies, while German civilians starved. Who should he be angry at? Canada for being kind to him, or Germany for lying to its people and leading them into destruction? Or himself for surviving when his brother didn't? In 1947, Hans heard something extraordinary. Canada was accepting German immigrants. Former prisoners of war could apply to come back. There was land, there were jobs, there was opportunity, there was a future. Over 6,000 German POWs eventually made that choice. They left Germany and went back to Canada. The country that had held them prisoner became their new home. They married Canadian women. They became farmers and businessmen. They built new lives in a land that had shown them mercy when their own country showed them only lies. Hans thought about it every day, every single day. He could go back. The farmer, Robert, had offered to sponsor him. He could have a real life, food, work, safety. But what about his mother? What about his sister? Could he abandon them? Leave them here to starve while he ate bacon and eggs in Canada? What kind of son would do that? What kind of person? In the end, Hans stayed. He stayed because of family, because of duty, because someone had to help rebuild Germany into something that wasn't built on lies. Someone had to stay and do the work. But he kept his English.
He practiced by reading old books he found in rubble. He kept photographs from Canada that he had somehow managed to keep through everything. A picture of the camp, a picture of the farm where he worked, a picture of the Christmas dinner. Someone had a camera. He kept those photographs in a box under his bed, and when times were hard, when the hunger was bad and the cold was worse, he would take out those photos and remember. Remember that there was a place in the world where enemies could become friends.
Where abundance was real. Where kindness wasn't weakness. Where treating people with dignity was normal, not exceptional.
Years later, in the 1960s, when Germany had recovered, when the Wirtschaftswunder had rebuilt the country, when people had food and jobs and hope again, Hans told his grandchildren about the camp with no fences, about the guard reading a newspaper, about the farmer who let him drive a tractor, about the Christmas dinner that changed everything, about the nurse who smiled at a German prisoner, about getting paid 50 cents a day to work on a farm while war raged across Europe. And he told them the truth he learned, the truth that haunted him and freed him at the same time. Canada won the war before they ever fought us, he said. They won by showing us what we could have been if we hadn't believed the lies. They defeated us not by breaking our bodies, but by proving we had been lied to our entire lives. The strongest prison isn't made of walls and wire and guards with guns. It's made of lies you believe about yourself and others. Lies about who's superior and who's inferior. Lies about who deserves dignity and who doesn't. And the only way to escape that prison is for someone to be kind enough to show you the truth, even when you're their enemy, especially when you're their enemy. That's what Canada did. They showed us the truth through kindness, and truth is the most powerful weapon that exists. Hans Müller lived until 1984. He never went back to Canada, but he never forgot it. In his mind, even in his last days in a hospital bed in Germany, he could still taste that Christmas turkey, still feel the warmth of that stove in the barracks, still hear Silent Night sung in German while Canadian guards applauded, still see the face of the farmer who shook his hand and offered him a future, still remember the moment he realized that everything he had been taught was wrong, that the enemy wasn't evil, that superiority was a lie. That kindness was stronger than any weapon or bomb or tank. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy on the battlefield. It's showing them they were wrong about you, wrong about themselves, wrong about everything. And maybe, just maybe, giving them a chance to become something better than what they were. That's what Canada did, and Hans Müller never forgot.